Hi everyone, this is Stephanie at PayStream Advisors. Thanks so much for attending today's webinar. It's going to be all about harmonizing procurement and payables. And with that, I will turn it over to Constantine and Greg.
Great, thanks Steph, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Welcome to Harmonizing Procurement and Payables, a critical confluence for success. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Greg Lloyd. I'm the Senior Director here at PayStream Advisors, and I'm joined today by Constantine Limbarakis, the VP of Product Marketing at Determine. Welcome, Constantine.
Thank you, Greg, for having us on the webinar today. It's always a pleasure to be talking on some really good topics with you guys at PayStream, and we look forward to talking about this this particular one because of the importance of the theme.
Yeah, I agree. We're glad to have you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with PayStream, we're a team of experts in all things back office processes and software. Whether we're talking about sourcing and supply chain to procurement and accounts payable to payments and expense management. We use this expertise to help our subscribers and clients in a number of ways. First is through our free research reports and tools on our website, paystreamadvisors.com, which is where a lot of the data I'm going to discuss today comes from. These reports cover industry trends, adoption rates, as well as profile leading solutions for practitioners. Another way we help out our clients is through thought leadership via speaking engagements. We do a free webinar almost every week, and even if you can't attend a live event, they're always available on demand on our website. The final way we help our clients is through advisory services. We help organizations plan for automation with current state analysis and needs assessments, build an ROI case for automation, choose the right solution for them, and negotiate the best deal. We'll also stick around for implementation and help things go smoothly from there, too. So, Constantine, why don't you tell us a little bit about Determine?
Thanks, Greg. I, again, wanted to thank PayStream for having us here on the webinar today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Determine, we are an organization that's focusing on empowering decisions. We are a cloud platform solution focused in source-to-pay with over 300 clients around the globe, working with a variety of the industry analysts and our clients to help really promote the needs and the focus of how to advance the profession of procurement, contract management, and sourcing. By being a global company, we look to talk about topics such as these, and our organization is one that has offices throughout the world. So we have places in San Mateo, Atlanta, and Indianapolis as our headquarters, but also look at globally in places like London, Paris, Hamburg, and Odessa as part of our development efforts. As an organization, we also work on a number of different client types and not necessarily focused on any particular industries, but as you can see from the different organizations that we work with, we are dealing with industry topics that are top of mind for many organizations that are looking to, again, advance the cause of accounts payable and procurement. And we look forward to really promoting this discussion today because of what we've heard in the field and how we think we could improve and address the challenges that accounts payable and procurement have in collaborating to today and in the future.
Well, great. Thanks, Constantine, for that great overview and great introduction. With that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about realities in Procure-to-Pay and the true costs of disharmony. Constantine's going to talk about creating a confluence for success. Then I'll give a little bit on preparing for the future, and then we'll save plenty of time at the end for questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Before we start going through the data, I'd just like to give folks a quick introduction to where our data comes from. Every year, we survey hundreds of professionals in back office finance across various industries. Titles include Director, VP of Finance, Accounts Payable, Controller, Procurement, CFOs, Treasury, Sourcing, and Supply Chain. The data we're going to go through comes from our most recent survey of over 250 such professionals, and it's available in our 2017 P2P for Indirect Spend report that you can find on our website, and also our Pitching ROI for Automation report, again, that you can find on our website. So this data here comes from our 2017 P2P Indirect Spend report, as I mentioned earlier. And the key thing here is that you'll see it shows a majority of organizations do have a centralized procurement process, which is good news. Not surprisingly, size plays a big role here. Large organizations are more likely to have a decentralized process than smaller organizations. as they typically have multiple locations. While many organizations may have a centralized procurement department, of course that doesn't mean that they're using effective tools for ordering goods and communicating. You can see here 71% of our respondents send their POs via email, but the problem is that email may not always be the best method. It can enable problems that lead to over-budget spend, employees purchasing items from out-of-date supplier lists, things like that. And so those are really the risks, even if you're using email, that you'll gain from having a more automated solution. So looking at some data, one of the questions we asked our survey participants is, what areas would you like to see the greatest process improvement to your procurement process? So you'll see the biggest one here was 21% said they'd like to gain improvements in cost control and supplier negotiations. A lot of this comes from having greater control of the suppliers that are in there, making sure the latest suppliers and offerings are in there, having centralized buying and the tools to control that. On the supplier negotiation side, it's about having the right pricing, it's about controlling how the invoices are submitted, and things like that. Some of the other things you see here at 19% are spend visibility. One of the big things here is really helping the accounts payable department get insight into what was ordered versus what they're paying for. Next one you'll see here at 14%, the ease of requisition and approval process. And of course that feeds into the one at 12% of integration of AP within the procurement process, and how AP can get access and insight into that requisition and approval process. Constantine, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are the biggest complaints that you hear from your customers and what they're looking to improve?
Yeah, it's interesting, Greg. We will never get away from the notion that cost and driving savings will be the -- reality for Procure-to-Pay. I can't tell you how many research papers I've actually read or even written myself, and information that we've gotten from our clients here at Determine on that note. But what's amazing to me is that what we don't see higher there in that scope is purely on the integration AP with procurement process. And what we're constantly hearing is that sometimes that disconnect is creating an inefficiency model. And it's not on the core process areas that we typically think of within the procurement realm of a typical product catalog item matching a PO process, but it's now where we're getting really into the more complex areas of spend, where people are trying to be more aggressive with, say, their second and third generation level of a procurement tool, and trying to integrate that, whether it's a back-end system with SAP or Oracle, or trying to improve the way they're doing invoicing within a P2P solution. So I'm kind of surprised by that number being a little lower. And even the data accuracy and ease of use, those always tend to be the big complaints of, it always has to be easier to use. But again, it's not surprising that if you're going to break down the numbers, on 100%, to say that, cost is still the #1. So some interesting points that you guys have here in the research, but it's definitely worth talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point on integration, one of the things that we see with a lot of our consulting clients is how much time people spend dealing with issues that come from not having integration or not having the right automation. And we're going to talk in a few slides about some of the time that people spend there. But I absolutely agree. I think it's just something sometimes people don't even realize that they're spending that much time on, and that it impacts them, and that it's as much of a problem to solve. So I completely agree. With that, move ahead to our next question. So here you can see the most common reasons organizations implement electronic procurement solutions. And you can see here that improved control and visibility are the top 2 benefits that organizations report when they implement the solution. Another one you'll see in here is at 19%, the reduced time to fill cycle times. And that's another one where as you improve automation, you get better procurement processes. That enables people to do things faster. You're not relying on manual methods. You're not relying on methods that could get lost or delayed or fall behind. And so that's another thing that we hear customers seeing great improvement in. Again, Constantine, would love to pause for a minute and see what improvements you see most from clients when you implement your solution.
I think the top 3 there are ones that if I had to go back and look and say, wow, when you guys did the question and I was thinking about this topic as a part of a discussion on a webinar, I mean, they're pretty much dead on. The idea of control and security is something that we've been really promoting a lot as part of what we're doing here at Determine, because of having the idea of knowing, where your data resides, particularly when you're dealing with global rollouts and dealing with Privacy Shield and things like that. The concern of security and control, but then that visibility and transparency is also so key. And I think that's really part of the theme of this topic today. So if you're thinking about how does procurement know what accounts payable knows and vice versa, and how are they being able to do that in a common way? And that's a lot of the theme that we're going to want to talk about today. And then again, the end goal is let's get this thing to reduce the cycle time of getting, a purchase order completed, or getting a requisition approved, or getting the invoice matched and paid, and particularly when you're dealing with more of the complexities of higher level types of spend, not just some of the simpler areas that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, this is spot on. I think those top three really make sense.
It's good to see that you guys are seeing consistency as well across what we see from our survey data. So with that, I'd like to move into a discussion on the true costs of disharmony. So in this first question, you'll see we asked our participants how integrated are their procurement and accounts payable functions. And you'll see here 49% say they're completely separate, while another 23% say they're separate with some shared metrics. And so when you total that up, that's over 70% of our respondents do not have full integration between their procurement and their accounts payable processes, departments, excuse me. So with that, I'd like to go ahead to our first poll question. Generally, how would you rate the relationship between accounts payable and procurement in your organization? And Constantine, while we're waiting for folks to respond, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what you hear from your clients and prospects.
I think it really depends on the history of the technology rollout and also the history of the organization. Particularly, for instance, if we're dealing with the centralized model for procurement, if it's center-led versus decentralized, there's various ways of peeling the onion, if you will, of how this overall is being impacted. But I think the biggest area that has an impact on how people react to this is on really the process and the automation that's there that allows for these two distinct organizations, often within the company to work together. And if they have that access to information and visibility, you'll tend to see that there's less dysfunctionality between the two. But again, it has a lot to do with organizational dynamics as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and see our results. Very interesting. So with that, would love to talk a little bit about the true cost, the actual cost here. So you'll see one of the questions we've asked our participants is how many hours do you spend each week on resolving AP process issues? And you'll see 36% spend 1 to 3 hours a week, 35% spend 4 to 8 hours a week. That's 71% of people spending 1 to 8 hours a week resolving AP process issues. And really what this is just one hand not knowing what the other hand is doing. We talk to a lot of clients here, and a lot of them have issues where their AP folks are going back to procurement to get a copy of a PO, or the PO was missing some information. Or even if they don't have to go back to procurement, when they used an OCR provider, for example, to get things loaded, a manual paper invoice loaded, some particular information of the order number didn't get loaded, or for whatever reason something didn't get done correctly. And so they end up just becoming detectives. They have to hunt down procurement staff to find out why things were ordered. They have to find out about pricing information that seems outdated. They have to confirm that purchases were authorized, so on and so forth. And so that really gets to the true cost here and the challenge of what the AP folks have to deal with. So moving along into actual numbers, you can see a table here with some estimates. The way we calculated this is we assume an average annual salary of $45,000 per AP staff member, 3 weeks of PTO, 2 weeks of combined holiday and sick leave, and then a 20% overhead calculation. But what you can see here is that all of this time required for AP staff to handle invoice and payment disputes adds up pretty quickly. All that time they're spending doing research and playing detective, it has a cost that comes with it. And some organizations are spending thousands of dollars each year on this detective work and this damage control alone. Now, if you can imagine maybe 10 clerks are spending this amount of time per week, those costs add up, and those are something that really need to be considered when you're looking at your current processes and looking at the possibility of implementing a solution. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Constantine to talk about creating a Confluence for success.
Okay, thanks a lot, Greg. You know, those are some really interesting numbers, and you know, to me, it's all about getting into the details of what we can do to change the nature of the relationship. So, you know, we started out with this conversation, and I remember in getting together with PayStream earlier this year, we were saying, hey, what's something we really want to talk about? And you know, this is one of these topics that really keep coming up. How do AP and procurement get along? And as we talked about earlier, there's a number of reasons for this, and there's these challenges that, you know, we just shared with some of the research. But if we want to really break it down, I think sometimes it's just going back to basics is essential for helping us understand what we can really do to how to make sure that these two different groups get along better. And so what I did is I thought of really kind of 3 areas that we've seen from a determined perspective that we think can help create this better Confluence for success by improving the relationship. And these 3 are expanding the visibility for AP and procurement, getting them to have a wider view, being able to also digitize the AP and procurement approach by getting it down to what we call lowest common denominator. And I'm going to explain that in the slide in a few moments here. And then finally, is once you're able to expand the visibility and digitize the process of getting what you're really looking for in where these are, you're then able to understand some of the real specific pain points that are coming up as a result of some of the things that Greg just came up with in terms of what are we missing, what information is lacking, and then why is that information lacking, and how do we change that? So let's go through these kind of in a way, in a very clear and succinct way that will help us maybe take another look at why these problems are occurring and how to improve them. So this first slide has got a lot of information on it in terms of the procurement process. And when we think of it, traditionally organizations think of the process between procurement and purchasing as a very kind of siloed way, if you will. And the graphic really shows this kind of accurate approach, but it's kind of an approach that is very typical. So for instance, what you see is really where, you know, we've been preaching this for a decade, is the value of procure-to-pay automation and what you can accomplish. So if you walk through the steps, procurement, this really means focusing on a procure-to-order process. You go through your catalog, your off catalog, et cetera. You link that back to a contract, or you look at a recurring contract. You wonder if there's a request for quote as part of that process, and then if there's a request for quote, you select a supplier. Otherwise, you go through, you get the purchase order, you wait for the product to come in, you either centrally receive it or you get it at a dock, and then accounts payable magically comes in and says, hey, we need to get this invoice, as Greg was mentioning earlier. We need to scan that or maybe have it emailed to us, however that process comes through, whether it's through a supplier portal. We do the matching, we automate it, and then we issue payment. So, you know, this is the very core. I mean, if we were going to talk about accounts payable and P2P 101, right, this would be what you'd want to teach, no question. But then when we get to the problems that we're talking about, one of the things that we're seeing is that we just don't have that extra visibility. So oftentimes there might not be a common technology framework, so you might not have a common accounts payable system with e-procurement, or it might just be that people aren't enabled enough on the system. It's hard to use, so people don't know how to use it. And then accounts payable is always trying to find the right person to track down because they did a maverick spend approach and they didn't even create a purchase order properly, or whatever the issue is. And so what I think helps us is to maybe take a look at the problem not so much in a isolated, siloed fashion based on those processes before, but really looking to expand the visibility by taking a definition of what it really means to be doing your procurement function and doing the accounts payable function in a much wider way. So the ability of working with a core platform that addresses all of these that I show on the screen is something that's essential. And, you know, for instance, I just got back from a conference in Florida a day ago, and, you know, I heard this issue about, you know, we just onboarded a new supplier management system, and they have a supplier management system that's siloed out there. And we asked the question of, okay, you're trying to manage compliance and risk, but how are you integrating that with your P2P and accounts payable and procurement? And they're like, well, we do that in a different system. So the problem that we have is when you don't have the visibility of a common system or a platform, if you will, then you're lacking the visibility of what's going on in those other approaches. And then you're causing these problems to occur because there's dysfunction throughout that process. So the argument I'm making here is by expanding that and saying that if I'm accounts payable, I have access to supplier management, financial management, information on sourcing, asset management, inventory, or contract management, I'm able to see those processes, even though if I'm not directly involved with how they're engaged initially, I have that information and I know what to do with it. So with that part of it, what we could do here now is say, we're now actually expanding the view. So what I did is I took the core processes and expanded those now and say, well, look, if procurement and accounts payable now have access to these additional areas like what's actually happening in the contract authoring process, and on the left, after an RFP is created because we had an RFQ, or on the bottom left section where, you know, we've already validated a supplier and we have a contract amendment because we're renewing that contract and we're going in through that process to actually do the request. That now gives us that visibility to understand what has happened, what's the history, what's the audit trail that has been created prior to me now getting this invoice and not knowing what to do with it. And it goes with all these processes, and the areas that we're really seeing a lot more interest in, particularly with who we talk to when people want a P2P system, is now they're saying, I just don't want P2P, but I want to be able to have a validation process that if I'm going to have a purchase order created, or if I'm going to actually try to buy something off of a recurring contract, or if I'm going to try to understand where that asset came from, I want to have these validations in place, and where did those validations occur? And how did I get, you know, from point A to point B, and we know what that audit trail is. So this is all a part of this expanding the visibility for AP and procurement. The next one is really what I like to use is the analogy along the lines of Khan Academy. So for those of you who are kind of geeks like me that, you know, like to go out there and try to do some extra learning, or even refer to these sometimes when you're trying to help your 8th grader with their math and you forgot the fundamentals and you have to go back, Khan Academy is a great resource. So not plugging it, but I kind of am because it's really good. But the point I'm trying to make here is their view is when you look at mathematics and you're saying, I want a lowest common denominator, let's think of that in terms of what that means for accounts payable and procurement. And what I've done here is said, well, if we look at all the components of what happens during the procurement process and you have a common platform or a common solution to be able to look at it, what you're looking at here is really the fundamentals of what you need to know and when it was created. So if you look at the middle column, for instance, you start with the requisition, as we all know, and then you might create multiple line items from that requisition. But then what's the information associated with that? We're going to have project information, budget information, accounts, the entries that are being created. We're then also going to have something about the supplier. Hopefully we have a contract associated with that supplier, or if it's not, something that's off contract that we'd have to create one. But we'd have some contract information. And then once we add that item, we're going to know something about the type of asset, the category it belongs to, why we're buying it, maybe a UNSPSC code, et cetera, that is linked to that. Then when we go through the process and we then create the purchase order, one or many that we create from the requisition, and then we go through the receipt process, we can then look and see, well, where's the invoice coming from? Did that supplier split, you know, the invoice from many different purchase orders? What's that process? We have the ability then to go back and easily link what's happened based on these fundamental lowest common denominator objects in the system that allow us to know what's happening and create that linkage in the audit trail that I was talking before. So this is something that we've been talking about here at Determine, calling establishing an end-tier matching at any level. So in the system, you're able to know at an invoice level, I know all the requisitions that are associated with this receipt from the supplier, or I know all the purchase orders are related, or all the invoices, and then being able to easily click down within a few clicks and understand what's going on, what's happened, and you're not then having to have this disharmony between procurement and accounts payable because you have this knowledge. And then the last but least process is the understanding of really the specific pain points that we're seeing in the whole area of the challenge. So, you know, I go through these ideas of often we're looking at the simple view, right, of Procure-to-Pay, and you're looking at some of these easier areas to understand. But when you're looking at some of the specific pain points because of the evolution of where we're at with P2P today, we're dealing with much more complex scenarios, let's just say, that we maybe didn't have when we first started this journey, as I said, 10 to 15 years ago with the first rollout of e-procurement technologies. And I think where most of those pain points are is in these complex scenarios. So Greg, when we talk about this and looking at your research, it would be interesting to go back to really hone in on those specific use cases. Is it that I can't find the PO? Is it that somebody did something wrong in the system and they didn't enter it correctly? Whatever those challenges are, they might be unique to every company. What we're finding at Determine is that they are really oftentimes now that more complex model. We're being asked to do more. We're being asked to do a lot more in the services side. You're dealing with more complex spend, and that's really creating, I think, an elevated challenge. And it's part of the reason why we keep seeing this issue of accounts payable and procurement at odds, is because you're trying to do more with what you already have or what you've invested in from an ROI perspective. So what I have here then is the number 3 way of looking at trying to improve the relationship is then understanding those specific pain points. And so what I did here is called out really 3 unique type of complex areas that are mapped back to where the transition point between a procurement person and an accounts payable person would happen. So the first example that I have here is with the blanket PO. So imagine in this case you have a blanket purchase order because you're buying something. In the example I'm using is marketing spend. You have materials, you have events, and you issue a blanket requisition or a blanket PO, and the whole point there is to be able to just keep spending against that and then making sure that you're getting approval through the process. And then because of the nature of the fact that it is a blanket PO and there's not necessarily one specific requisition at a time, the invoicing process then, the accounts payable, has a better notion and understanding of how to go back and attribute what those costs are, get the approval, and then be able to create the entries that tie back to that blanket process. And again, because marketing spend is one of those complex areas, it's very critical to understand the point of transition and what was happening in terms of what initiated the reason for the purchase in the first place from that vendor or supplier. A second example is where we're dealing with, say, blanket contracts. In this case, we're seeing where you're dealing with, say, direct spend of, say, raw materials, maybe MRO, supplies, packaging, et cetera. And in this case, because you might be always going to that same vendor, you deal with the blanket contract, and you're dealing with an approval process, requisition, PO, again, coding, receiving of those items, unlike where the marketing is, again, a service, maybe more than where you're dealing with direct spend here of products. And then you're dealing with the accrual of those AP entries, the invoicing, and then the actual AP entry itself once the project is, or once the process is completed. So again, understanding that exact transition point makes it very, very important for the differences between understanding that in the first scenario, I'm not receiving anything, there's no receipt of any product, whereas in the second scenario there is, and then you're able then to actually isolate what is actually happening in the business process as part of the approval flow, and being able to actually have more accuracy and auditability and visibility into what's actually happening. And then finally, the third example is one where we're seeing a huge increase in interest, and Many of us know that services procurement often makes up almost up to 50, 60% of a company's spend, or even more depending upon the industry. And in this scenario, this is one where you're dealing with time tracking. So here you have services, I'm tracking time, we have a requisition, we code the requisition, we get it approved, we get a PO, and then we have the consultant services, or the folks that are doing the services for us, tracking time by entering the time in, then we approve the time, we match that timesheet to the PO, and then accounts payable is able to go back and say, okay, we can accrue the AP entry, we look at the invoice, and then we go ahead and create the entry and go from there. So you can see in each one of these scenarios, you can have a complete breakdown in the process. If you don't know, as an accounts payable professional, what's happening, what was purchased, why it was purchased, and trying to do that within a succinct way with procurement, and then all the other folks that might be involved with those processes that have requisitioned or requested these services or products. So this is just, again, a way to understand that and a way to break it down to help us think of it in a different approach, and know that having a common platform approach to doing this will help significantly in the ability to go back and audit and understand what's happening in that business process, and by expanding that, the vernacular and the vision of what we say when we talk about procurement and accounts payable. And with that, what I'd like to do is ask here Greg the question is based on this breakdown, what have you guys been seeing from your perspective at PayStream, from research and just people that you talk to and your clients?
No, it's a great question, Constantine. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I think similar to what you've talked through here and what you're showing in this slide is there is always a little bit of variability, especially as you said, we get to more complex models, and the market has evolved over the last 10 plus years. But I think the point you were getting at, especially at the end there, was the importance of automation, and it's partly that where the transition occurs and the complexity that follows, but it's also about the back and forth. So even though a transition has occurred, to your point, being able to access all of that information that came earlier in those earlier steps, no matter what point the transition occurred, no matter what steps were occurring earlier or not, depending on the various types here, it's having all that information lined up so that you don't go back and forth. Once that transition occurs, that transition can occur smoothly, and there's no back and forth going between accounts payable and procurement. And really, that's the key of where an automated solution comes in, is it prevents that back and forth. It provides that capability to match and track all the information, again, to the exact points you've been saying here all along as you've been laying out in your slides. So I think it's a great question, and one of the key pieces that are important to how automation can help.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, and I'm glad we concur on some of these because this is what it's all about, is trying to figure these things out, and this is what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, I agree, Constantine. And so along those lines, let's go ahead and poll our audience, and let's get some feedback from the real world here. So our next poll question: which of these P2P areas do you find most difficult for you to manage today? Direct spend, i.e. raw materials, supplies, packaging; logistics, things like storage and transportation; fee-based services such as lawyers, accountants, and taxes; recurring spend, things like utilities, internet and telecom, etc., or services, things like consulting, marketing, interim. And Constantine, while we're having our audience respond to the poll, would love to hear your thoughts on what are some of the ones you hear the most complaints about from your customers.
Well, I'm gonna throw a little joke in here and saying it. Everyone's always complaining about paying lawyers and accountants, so that will be that'll be one. My guess will always be the services, the marketing, the consulting. It's those things that I think are the most complex. And but I could be wrong. It really depends on the business and what you rely on. But those will probably be the ones that are the highest. But we'll see. We'll see what the results are.
Yeah. Well, let's see the results. Very interesting. Well, thanks for all our survey respondents, our poll respondents. So with that, I want to go ahead and start talking about how to lay the groundwork for this harmonization process between the two departments. Last thing we want to do when we take on a process improvement initiative is to automate a flawed process. So it's really critical to make sure you do the right prep work before introducing a new technology. What we've found is that when organizations fail to do this, it's much harder to build the staff support needed and gain the internal momentum to make this technology really work. So you'll see here, these are some of the best practices that we've developed to help folks get ready. First and foremost, make sure that you get the right steering committee together with the right stakeholders and focus that group on understanding what it is you're trying to get out of this process improvement. And it's important also that you have a champion. Every good effort internally always needs a project champion, someone to really fight the good fight with you. And so make sure up front you've got that champion and you get the right stakeholders engaged so that you're going after the right things, you're looking at it the right way, and you've got the right internal support as you go about this. Second thing is to make sure you do a proper audit of the current workflow for your procurement and your payables. This is all about streamlining the process. This is about identifying the gaps and the problems and even the errors in your process before you automate it. If you automate a flawed solution, then you're not really getting the best solution. You're not really getting what you should out of an automated solution. So it's important to take that time up front and really understand what exactly your process is today and what you want it to be. And there's a couple pieces there. Part of that goes back to the first bullet point of having the right stakeholders and the right champion, so that you get all the right input, you get collaboration from the team, both from a perspective of honest answers about how the process works, as well as honest answers and a collaborative opinion on what it should be. Another thing, of course, here is working with your provider. They can also help you look at your current workflow and help provide insights. So don't discount that when you're going through this audit process. Next thing is identifying the most pressing needs that automation can address. This is partly related to auditing the process and understanding how it works, but it's also focusing in to know what are the things you're trying to solve. And especially on those, you really want to make sure you've thought about what the process should be with less focus on what it is today. Again, to make sure that you're going after those right areas. Next one, estimating the cost of not proceeding with the project. We've talked a little bit about this in earlier slides around time people spend being detective, that your AP clerks spend being a detective. So that's one cost. There are other costs around lost spend or misused spend, where people are using out-of-date pricing or out-of-date vendors or not really hunting for the best deal. So a lot of those things that an automated solution can help you improve, you've got to make sure you really understand what all those costs are and make sure you put forth the effort to understand what are the costs of not proceeding with a project for automation, because there's a lot of them, and it really can help as you look at proceeding with a solution, including with that steering committee and that project champion. Next one is a communications plan and implementation timeline. It's really important to communicate with all your team, with your procurement folks, your AP folks. Really communicate what you're doing, why you're doing it is also critically important. Help people understand the why of what you're doing and how it's going to improve things and how it's going to make things easier. And also the implementation timeline. People can get nervous, so you've got to help them understand not only the why, but also the pieces of when. What you're doing, when you're doing it, how it's going to move forward, how it's going to happen. And an important piece that I think should be assumed in all of that is making sure that all the right people of the team, your AP clerks, your procurement folks, that they're all involved in this, so that it's not just handing them something, but it's making sure they have a chance to weigh in on how things should be communicated, how they should be implemented, and really make it as collaborative a process as you can. So those are some of the best practices that we've seen at our clients and out in the marketplace, and we've gotten through some of our data and surveys. But Constantine, I'd really love to hear your thoughts here. What are some other best practices you guys promote or that you've seen some of your clients take on?
Well, I think it all kind of goes back to the, what we're trying to what problem are we trying to solve, and how are you trying to do this? So, you don't want to be drinking from the fire hose. So if you address the big areas of what you're trying to solve, and then know how the process and technology can work with it, then you're able to take kind of that approach and saying, we may want to address certain types of spend first. We may have the fundamentals to do it all, but maybe not trying to drink, again, from this fire hose. So ways that we've seen it is kind of then looking at maybe questions that you want to throw out there. So, one thing might be to say, well, if we're trying to link our ERP system back to our P2P, is, we're trying to look for improved budget tracking and cost allocation with our financial systems. Well, how do we enable that, and how do we, get that project going? Or how are we trying to improve spend transparency by, do we want to enable a strategic sourcing technology as part of this bigger process with procurement, and how is that organized? Or are we looking to kind of keep that separate for now because we may have a system that's out there? Or maybe looking at lowering AP and transaction costs. We're trying to lower the cost of managing per transaction. So maybe we establish some KPIs to say, this is what we estimate a cost to create an invoice is. Maybe we can do that to measure over a course of time, maybe work with a consultancy and a technology provider to start measuring the benchmarking there. Another one might even be like the onboarding and certification. Like, how important is that as part of you doing a deployment of P2P? Maybe you're doing it initially, or maybe you're saying we need to now introduce that process into or improve that process because we haven't done an audit and we realize we're not doing well there. How do we introduce that? Or even finally, how do you improve even your contract management capabilities? Are you trying to integrate what you're doing from a procurement contract spend standpoint, from a tracking and an allocation back to the actual authoring and approval process of any kind of new contract or recurring contract that's in the process? So there's a lot of things to digest, a lot of things to do to harmonize this, but it all goes back to, trying to break it down into chunks that are digestible and really try to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish and what problems you're trying to solve and when they occur. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, those are some great points, and I agree. It goes back to that slide where you talked about some of the different ways and where the handoff occurs, and trying to take off smaller chunks, and because that really can get complex. So absolutely, a lot of great points in there. Well, thanks very much, Constantine. That's all the time we've got today, so we'd like to move on to our Q&A session here. Stephanie, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you, and you can go through some of the questions that we've gotten from our audience. And Constantine, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So we've been getting a lot of questions here, and there's a few of these that I wanted to take a minute to answer here because I think they might be relevant for everyone. So Constantine, would love to get your insight on this.
Sure.
Now this first one comes, so this first one comes from Barb, and it's basically, we got a few different variations of this question, so I think it's an important one. Basically, what would you think of as the best model for establishing collaboration between AP and procurement? In other words, where do I start?
Yeah, that's always kind of like the fundamental, right? That's kind of how we started this, is going back to basics a little bit and understanding. So I would think the starting point is really understanding the magnitude of where the biggest problem is. Too often people go into the process of trying to solve the problem with just throwing technology on top of it and not really looking at the pieces that they're going through. And in fact, I had a call today with a company that we're working with and doing an ROI analysis, and that very thing just came up where we were looking at saying, okay, well, what's the analysis of implementing this Procure-to-Pay, and how do I measure the value of that in terms of working with procurement and accounts payable? And it was interesting to me that they hadn't really gotten into that devil of the details, and while we were looking at process and efficiency, they were looking at this purely from a strategy and saying, well, how do we justify the cost of who we're working with the team that we have, and then increasing their strategic value to show the value of what this would, bringing a technology in would do. So, I think it goes back to that. And if you could understand the core problems that you're really trying to solve with the technology is always going to be the enabler. It's not the end game. It's the way of getting to what you want to be. And I think that's just the easiest way to answer that question.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that makes sense. The communication is just so important there. And another question we've got that comes from Vishal, and this is kind of an extension of the last question too, but does it really matter if we're decentralized? Is that going to be more difficult for us to kind of build this collaboration if we are decentralized as a department, or is it better to kind of start from a place of a centralized relationship?
Yeah, the classic decentralized, centralized, center-led, those are kind of almost sometimes academic topics, but when you talk to professionals in the field, it's very real to them. And I would say that question really has a lot to do with the intent of how you're going to configure your system, right? So what are the back ends that you're needing to integrate with? Obviously, at some point, you're going to have some kind of ERP or financial system you're integrating with, and understanding how that flow of information needs to happen from users, a common set of users, et cetera. So I don't think it matters as much to worry about whether it's decentralized or centralized. It certainly makes it easier from a negotiation standpoint. So when you're starting to include contracts into this process, I think that has a bigger issue in terms of volume and being able to track spend and knowing where rebates come in, et cetera. But when you're just trying to get the process, the basics, and you're rolling out from one location to the next, I think that it really goes back to how you're really trying to configure the system and who you're allowing to have access to that information in terms of workflow and visibility into dashboards and cockpits, so that they can understand, when I showed those slides on the flow with the lowest common denominator, how are we ensuring that those folks that are trying to track down the problem are able to have that access. So if they're decentralized in, if we're just procurement, or in terms of a financial decentralization, what if they're just a business unit, or they're, a certain subsidiary of a parent? It really depends on how the company's set up. But I think it goes back to making sure you configure the system appropriately and know that you have a system, that you're working with one that will allow you to have the ability to manage the organizational dynamics that you're trying to model. And once those are established, then you could do a lot of these things that we're saying in terms of mapping back to what you need to know. So the organizational model needs to be able to be reflected in the system first of all, and then once you're there, you're able then to try to accommodate some of these complexities with the system. So that's a great question, and but it's something that I don't think can be just solved by just saying, okay, this is how you have to do it. So.
Right.
I'm not sure if I answered it 100%, but that's a tough question. So
no, I think that's helpful, because I think a lot of people assume, well, if we're not centralized already, we may as well, give up. So, so I think that's a great insight there.
I would also say that a lot of companies, just to kind of finish the thought, I think a lot of companies have gone toward a centralized and center-led model, but again, that may not be best practice depending upon the industry that they're in. So, but that's generally the trend that we've seen as a business.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. And this next question comes from Neil. What are some quick policy and process areas that we can tackle, kind of right out of the gate? What would you suggest there?
Well, it kind of goes back to simple to complex, right? But then it always, again, of course, depends on the industry and the type of spend that you're trying to manage. And the reason why I bring that up is that if you just look at some of the research out there, when you're dealing in a very strong manufacturing scenario, services procurement, for instance, is a much lower percentage of your total addressable spend than if you're dealing with a services-focused type business like a financial services or professional services. So say you're a consultancy or an investment bank or a credit union or whatever. And I would think that the way the policy and procedure would be to, again, look at the biggest, where you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck, and then try to model the policy and procedure that'll address that. So if you're, for instance, a company that we work with, a very large company in the entertainment industry, they're all about marketing because their branding is everything. And they're making music and entertainment and all these things, but the key here is it's an intangible. So so they're not going to be as worried about dealing with a catalog process. They're not going to be as worried about dealing with a very fixed kind of receiving. But the issue is they're trying to figure out how to manage the budget that they're allocated to spend against for a project that is marketing related, and they're trying to get a release of some product, whether it's an album or whether it's a production of a show or whatever. So that to me is really the key. It's understanding policy and procedure based on the magnitude of the spend that you're trying to address. Maybe use Pareto, a Pareto principle, because you're not going to address everything right off the bat, and especially if you're initially deploying a procure-to-pay system. There's going to be enough to digest and tackle that you're trying to get users to adapt to. So maybe in some ways you almost may want to do it on a pilot basis if you realize that there's a certain amount of spend, particularly in the services area or in MRO, that you think could be really easily addressed and help that relationship between AP and procurement right off the bat, and then slowly start relating other process or category areas over time. So that would be my, I think, a little bit kind of simple answer, but not so obvious sometimes. Sometimes I think the simplest answers aren't always the obvious ones, but it's the ones we always should gravitate to because it's probably what's going to work the easiest. So those are just some of my experiences and recommendations that I could provide the audience with on the phone here today.
Great. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think you're right. Sometimes the simplest is not the most obvious, but often, more effective. So, yeah, thanks for that insight. I think that's all the questions that we have time for to take now. And I want to thank everyone for joining today, and thanks to Konstantin Limbarakis of Determine and Greg Lloyd of PayStream. And we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thanks so much, Konstantin.
Thank you.